Good morning, everyone. Hopefully this will make it a little bit easier for everyone in the room to hear me. So, some of you may be wondering, we have several people here from FDA talking, and they each seem to serve different roles. So just to kind of explain a little bit about that. When you submit a review package to FDA, normally it's assigned to a review team. And that review team would normally consist of a chemist, which is the function that Dr. Arvidsson serves. It'd also be assigned to a toxicologist, such as Dr. Jason Ongst, who talked earlier. Depending upon whether there's an environmental component, it would be also assigned to an environmental reviewist. And each of those different reviewers would focus on the aspects of that submission that corresponds to their task. So the chemist would look at the identity and exposure information. The toxicologist would look at the safety information used to support that the exposure that results is safe. The environmentalist would look at the environmental component. Well, I'm what's termed a consumer safety officer, which means basically I'm a project manager that shepherds your submission through the review process for FDA. Ensures that the questions from the reviewers get asked to the notifier or to the submitter, and also ensure that FDA fulfills its legal obligations during the review of your submission. So just to give you a little bit of background as to what the different roles are of some of the people who are giving you talks today, or giving talks here today. So the title of my presentation is U.S. Regulatory Framework for Food Packaging. A lot of the previous presentations that you've heard today dealt with the type of data that you would generate in order to submit data to a regulatory agency such as FDA. Well, the purpose of my talk is, as many of you are probably aware, there's several different regulatory mechanisms by which FDA would provide a regulatory approval for the use of a food contact material such as packaging. How do you choose which of these regulatory mechanisms to use to submit that data to FDA, and then what would be the result of those various mechanisms? So questions that were asked earlier today, for example, what's the difference between a generally recognized as safe status for a substance as opposed to a substance that is the subject of an effective food contact notification? Hopefully my talk will give you a better understanding of what the differences are, and also some information as to which regulatory mechanism you might want to choose to submit your information to FDA. So I'll start off with some legal definitions. Since we are a government agency, we're basically dictated by the law, and some of those legal definitions are a little esoteric, might not be as straightforward. Most people think, well, it's a food packaging material. Well, not always. And I'll go over the different types of regulatory mechanisms, and we'll do comparisons for mechanisms for what FDA terms to be food additives, and then a comparison of those mechanisms to substances that FDA considers to be generally recognized as safe. And then very, very briefly talk about regulatory support that FDA offers to people interested in submitting information to the agency. So if we first talk about legal definitions. So when it comes to food, most of what FDA does with food is dictated to us by the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That is the legal document which provides most of FDA's jurisdictional authority over foods, and therefore over food packaging. And if you look at the Act basically includes substances that migrate into food as a result of their use. So for example, packaging materials, components used in packaging, food processing equipment, things that come into contact with food. It includes those under the same definition as substances that are intentionally added to food, which most of the public would consider to be food additives. So things such as food texturizers, sweeteners, things of that nature that are intentionally added to food to have a functional effect in that food. That's what most of the public thinks of as food additives. And they wouldn't necessarily think that food packaging would also be a food additive, when in fact, for the purposes of FDA, they're the same thing. And the reason for that is both of these uses provide the opportunity for a substance to migrate into food and become a component of food, and the consumer to be exposed to that substance through the diet. So for the purposes of safety, which is one of the main emphases of FDA, our public health agency, for the purposes of safety, what's important to FDA is the fact that that substance is in the food and not necessarily how it got there, although once we talk about regulatory mechanisms, that does become important. It's also important to note that there are things which most people would think are food additives, which FDA would use a different term for. We wouldn't call them food additives. So for the purposes of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, things such as color additives, which are directly added to food in order to impart color in the food, those aren't food additives. Those are color additives. But the interesting thing is, once you use that color additive to add color to food packaging, all of a sudden it does become a food additive. It's a little esoteric part of the law, but that is something that's useful to know, because many of FDA's regulations, for example, the Code of Federal Regulations for colorants that are added to plastic packaging materials, that allows any color additive that's allowed for use in food, you can use that to color a food packaging material. And it doesn't have to be listed in that regulation. The regulation says anything that's allowed for use to color food, you can use it to color plastic packaging material. The other thing is substances that are termed generally recognized as safe, as well as prior sanctioned substances, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So, as we said before, many, from a use perspective, things such as generally recognized as safe substances that are added to food or used in food packaging, as well as prior sanctioned substances, from a use perspective, you would say, oh, those are food additives. But for the purposes of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, those substances are exempt from the definition of a food additive. And as we've stated before, GRAS substances can be used without prior FDA approval. We'll get into that more further in the talk. But, you know, why is there this difference? The main reason is historical and what the definition of a general recognized as safe or prior sanctioned material is. So historically, once the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was passed in 1958, it requires pre-market approval of any food additive before it's used in food. So before it's added to food, before it's used as a food contact material, it's required that you come to FDA and get pre-market approval. Well, you can imagine the daunting task before FDA when that regulation was passed. What do you do with everything that's already being used to package food or already being added to food? It would be impossible from a human resources standpoint for FDA to have basically given approval for all those substances. It would be much too big of a backlog. So what Congress did in order to prevent disruption of the food supply with the enactment of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, they basically allowed that any substance in use prior to 1958, and the key word being safe use prior to 1958, was considered generally recognized as safe and therefore exempt from the pre-market approval requirement for food additives. It was also recognized that before 1958, industry had come to FDA for certain substances and said, hey, we're using this. Is it safe? Are we allowed to use it? FDA had written opinion letters at that time saying that they were used, they were okay to be used. So basically, we'd given them prior sanction before the passing of 1958, and that's why prior sanctioned materials are also exempt from the definition of a food additive. So that's more the historical perspective. We would note that generally recognized as safe status can also apply to something that has been used since 1958. We'll talk about what the requirements for generally recognized as safe for use after 1958 are. It's mainly that there truly has to be generally available information that the product is used for its use and is safe for that use, and there has to be a general recognition among competent scientists that that material is safe. But if something truly is generally recognized as safe, and there's no question about the safety, allowing new uses to be considered GRAS reduces burden on the agency and for industry for substances which are truly generally recognized as safe. And as I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that as the talk goes on. So if we look at regulatory mechanisms for substances that are added to food, if you're talking about food additives that are used in food packaging that are not intended to have a technical effect on the food, most of those requirements as to which regulatory mechanism is available is based on exposure. So if your exposure results in a dietary concentration that's less than 0.5 parts per billion, you can submit a threshold of regulation exemption request to the agency. You can utilize that mechanism. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I would note there's a typo here for the food contact notification, that it should be a dietary concentration of less than 1 part per million. If you have a dietary concentration of less than 1 part per million, you can submit a food contact notification to FDA. And if the dietary concentration is greater than 1 part per million, FDA can require you to submit a food additive petition for the use, even if it is for a substance that's not directly added to food. If you have a food packaging material that somehow through its use results in a dietary concentration greater than 1 parts per million, FDA can require you to submit a food additive petition. As I said, we are going to get to GRAS notification here also, but the requirements for GRAS notification are not based on exposure. It's more based on the availability of and consensus on data concerning the safe use of that product. So data must be publicly available, and there must be a public consensus that the use is generally recognized as safe. And those can be submitted to the agency through the generally recognized as safe, or GRAS, notification program. It's important to note that the standard of safety is the same across all these regulatory mechanisms. I believe Dr. Onks talked about that earlier today, but it is basically there has to be a reasonable certainty of no harm from the any exposure that results from the intended use. Reasonable certainty of no harm is relatively self-explanatory. We have a regulation which states what a reasonable certainty of no harm is, but as we always like to point out, when Congress passed the act, Congress actually gave a little bit more information as to what reasonable certainty of no harm means, and it does not mean and cannot mean that there's proof beyond any possible doubt that no harm will result under any conceivable circumstance. So really Congress is saying it's hard to prove a negative, and you don't have to prove the negative for any conceivable circumstance. It just has to be for the exposure that's expected, the exposure that's been demonstrated as possible for coming out of the substance from the use. And as we've discussed in the previous talks, the information necessary to demonstrate safety is dependent upon the exposure to the material. The toxicology idiom of dose makes the poison is applicable here, and therefore, as exposure increases, we do have more stringent toxicological requirements. But it's also important to note that the exposure is determined by the intended use, and this allows refinement of the exposure calculations in order to give a more realistic evaluation of what the exposure will actually be. So if we look at mechanisms specifically for substances defined as food additives, I can kind of provide you what the differences are between a food additive petition, a food contact notification, and a threshold of regulation exemption in order to give you information as to which of those mechanisms you might want to consider. We've already talked about dietary concentration. I will note that the dietary concentration for FCNs is correct on this slide. It was not correct on the previous slide. But if we look at, for example, threshold of regulation, why a dietary concentration of 0.5 parts per billion? Well, in the 1990s, FDA did a comprehensive review of available information, toxicity information in our files and what was publicly available, as to what type of toxic effects that you saw depending upon the dietary concentration. Going back to the dose makes the poison. This comprehensive evaluation really demonstrated that at concentrations less than 0.5 parts per billion, the only toxicological endpoint of concern is carcinogenicity. So for that reason, if you look at the required safety data, for a threshold of regulation submission, you really only have to provide FDA, is there any information out there that shows that this substance or the impurities that may migrate as a result are carcinogenic? If there's no publicly available data information out there, or your company is not aware of any privately generated data that demonstrates carcinogenicity, that's really all you have to provide to FDA. You have to provide the results of a literature search. And that's a little different for FCNs. So for FCNs, between exposures of 0.5 parts per billion and 1 part per million, we have tiered toxicological testing requirements. Now, those are laid out in our toxicological guidance documents. They're relatively straightforward, and it depends if it's between 50 parts per, if it's less than 0.5 parts per billion, once again, we're talking carcinogenicity. There's another tox tier between 50 parts per billion and 0.5 parts per billion, and then there's another tox tier for exposures between 1 part per million and 50 parts per billion. So as exposure increases, more data is required, and we have guidance on that. If we look at petitions, since those are exposures greater than 1 part per million, we're really looking at that specific substance. What are the expected toxicological issues with that substance? And we would give recommendations as to what's required toxicologically on a case-by-case basis, but always that requirement would be greater than what's required for an FCN. Our study reports provided, yes, so if you're a company that's done your own toxicological studies on the substance for either a petition or an FCN, you would have to provide that to us. All 3 of these mechanisms have an environmental review component, so you would have to provide information as required under the National Environmental Protection Act, or NEPA. And once again, submission to FDA is required before marketing the product. But one of the things that's most important for most industry is a petition and a threshold of regulation exemption are specific to, anyone can use them. If a petition becomes effective or a threshold of regulation becomes effective, they are not specific to whomever submitted the information to us. That is different than a food contact notification. Under a food contact notification, that is specific to the manufacturer, and only the listed manufacturer can rely on that FCN to market their product. If a competitor or another manufacturer that makes the same material for the same use wants to market it, they have to come in with their own FCN to the agency. So that's often something that's attractive to industry. Also, if we look at the timelines, one of the things that's important is FDA's mandated 120 days for food contact notifications. Petitions are mandated 180 days, whereas threshold of regulation, there is no deadline. FDA can get done with that review as quickly or as long as it takes us, depending upon the information and the resources available to us. And that becomes important when you look at the result of FDA not completing the review. For an FCN, if FDA does not complete the review within 120 days, it doesn't matter. That FCN becomes effective unless FDA objects. So that's kind of a hammer on FDA that we have to get our review done in 120 days, because if we don't, that FCN becomes effective. This is different for petitions and threshold of regulations. Threshold of regulations, nothing happens until FDA completes its review. You can't sell your product until FDA is done with their review of your threshold of regulation. Same thing with petitions. Even though there is a 180-day mandated time frame, still, if FDA does not publish a regulation for the use of that substance within 180 days, you can't use it. You can't use it until after that regulation becomes published. So now let's talk about GRAS substances. So as we said before, from a use perspective, generally recognized as safe, you use them basically like other food additives, but as opposed to what FDA would consider to be a food additive, GRAS substances can be used without prior approval. As soon as everybody hears that, they're like, wait, you mean you don't have to submit a GRAS notification to FDA in order to use a substance that's generally recognized as safe? And the answer is no. Industry can reach a self-determination that the use of a substance is GRAS, but it's important to note the statutory standard for a generally recognized as safe substance is the same whether or not that's a self-determination or whether or not you submit a GRAS notification to FDA. The information used to support a GRAS determination must be publicly available, and there must be a public consensus that that information demonstrates that the use of that substance in food packaging is generally recognized as safe. That can be somewhat difficult to tier to meet. The publicly available information standpoint, a lot of companies do their own internal tox testing that they don't publish literature articles on. That information is not publicly available. It can't be used to support a GRAS self-determination. Also, a lot of substances out there, there might be public controversy as to whether or not that substance is generally recognized as safe or not. If you submit it to FDA, FDA can be the arbitrator of determining whether or not it's safe. If you don't submit it to FDA, the public is the determinant as to whether or not that substance is safe. So FDA has recently published a final rule which defines the criteria for generally recognized as safe substances, and it's important to note that FDA offers a GRAS notice review, which can especially be important for instances where consensus on publicly available information may be questioned. An examination of problematic instances in the past where self-determination of GRAS did become a problem for industry is partially hydrogenated oils or trans fats. FDA recently made a determination that, in fact, their use is not generally recognized as safe. And that becomes a problem for companies that have relied on a self-GRAS determination for trans fat materials, or trans fat for addition to food. Also, difference between GRAS notification and food additive mechanisms. There's some differences. As I said before, the technical basis of safety has to be generally available for a GRAS notification or for self-GRAS determination, not so for food additives. There has to be a general consensus on safety, a truly public general consensus on safety for GRAS substances and for GRAS notifications, not so for food additives. Environmental review is not required for GRAS notifications, which is required for food additives, and there's a difference in who can utilize the result. If something's truly generally recognized as safe, anyone can use it. If something is listed as the subject of an effective food contact notification, only the listed manufacturer can use that product. And it's also one other important thing to note that if you do submit a GRAS notification to FDA, there are some timelines around there. I believe, although I'm not the expert on that, that FDA normally tries to reply to GRAS notifications within 90 days with the option to extend that review to 180 days. But I would recommend you contact the agency in order to make sure that that timing is correct. So just very, very quickly, US FDA regulatory support. FDA does try to educate our stakeholders, especially through the use of pre-petition or pre-notification consultations. If you're putting together data to submit to FDA, don't wait until you have it all planned out, our tests are already done, and you're submitting it as a food contact notification or as a formal submission. If you have questions as to how to do a study, what study is appropriate, come talk to FDA beforehand. We have the pre-petition or pre-notification consultation process. It's free, and it works out better for you and for us because it's easier for us to take care of these problems in the beginning than when we get them formally submitted to us. We have our guidance documents. We'll have a link to it at the end of this presentation, and we are trying to do outreach and involvement at industry stakeholder meetings and conferences such as this one put on by ILSI. My presentation does have a link to our current guidance documents. These are guidance documents for GRAS notifications, petitions, and food contact notifications. And with that, I'll ask if there's any questions.
So can you give us an idea of how long on average, or maybe a span, is our threshold of regulation decisions and how many you get? Like how many do you get a year, or how often does it happen? I know we've seen numbers on FCNs often at conferences.
Yeah, so FDA actually does not receive very many threshold of regulations a year. We receive about 5, 6 a year, something like that. And a lot of that if you looked at how long it takes to do a tour, you would say, wow, I don't want to do that because that takes a long time to get approval. But how long it would, that is if you look at the average amount of time. But in reality, if someone provides all the information required for a tour, FDA can get it done very quickly. We could get it done in 30 days. We have before. But most people see, oh, it's a threshold of regulation exemption. It's exempt from regulation. Therefore, I don't have to provide FDA much information. So what we found is we have to do a lot of educating for a threshold of regulation process, more so than we have to do for FCNs because, to be quite honest, the submitters take FCNs more seriously than they take the threshold of regulations. So if you look at the guidance document and you provide us the good information demonstrating that that dietary concentration is less than 0.5 parts per million, this is what's in the substance, this is what the impurities are, FDA can get that done very quickly. I know you might be thinking about submitting a tour for a lot of different substances. That might take a little bit longer. But
We'll group them.
The answer is FDA can get tours done faster than we can FCNs.
At what point in the process does EPA get involved? Do you guys decide? I know if it's a pesticide, that could be an additive. You know, antimicrobials are a good example of one that could be a pesticide or it could be a food additive. So do you guys determine that, or does EPA, or how does that work?
Well, so for the most part, you should always contact EPA if you're using something like a pesticide. If your question is specific to antimicrobials, there is some jurisdictional overlap between FDA and EPA, and there are other things that you might think there would be jurisdictional overlap where there's actually not. So for example, sanitizing solutions applied to food processing equipment. That is not FDA's jurisdiction. That's purely EPA. You would not submit that information to FDA. If it's an antimicrobial applied to a food contact surface that is not packaging, that would be purely EPA. That would not be FDA. If you are submitting the information for antimicrobial that's, for example, applied to packaging, however, that would be FDA, and EPA may have some FIFRA requirements. What we always tell people in those type of situations where there's overlap is talk to both agencies early and often, because it's going to be very dependent on your specific situation. Hopefully Dennis isn't coming up to tell me I said something wrong.
This is not a question, but just further to that particular question, there is an information sharing MOU between FDA and EPA on the pesticidal issues, and we have been working on developing an SOP so that there can be, if industry submits to both agencies, concurrent reviews so that the review is done at the same time. The labeling requirements that APA has to impose on the pesticidal uses could reflect what FDA has done in terms of our reviews. So there is an effort to do that. That SOP has not been fully developed yet. But that's the ultimate goal between the two agencies.
So is it the same paperwork essentially they're looking at?
Well, I mean, the data requirements might be a little bit different in terms of what, especially if you're looking at through the food contact notification program. Some of these antimicrobial treatments may not go through the food contact notification program on the FDA side. They may go through the petition process. They might even go through the GRAS process. So it really is a matter of, having a discussion with each agency on which regulatory program to go through. But in terms of going forward, we're trying to align the two programs to the extent we can, with the understanding that, the sponsor is going to have to go to both agencies, but we can try to share information and do concurrent reviews and hopefully to time.
And one further complication for antimicrobials, if you're applying antimicrobial to meat or poultry, FDA also shares jurisdiction with USDA on those. So FDA will look at the safety and technical effect data. USDA will look at the efficacy within the actual plant. So you would have to submit information to FDA you'd also have to provide information to USDA. You might be 3.
Try.